Tad Mitchell's stomach growled as he clutched the plastic bag filled with empty bottles, counting each one in his head. 17. Not enough. The recycling center paid 5 cents per bottle, and he needed at least 30 to buy a loaf of bread from the discount store. The cold February wind cut through his too-thin jacket, making him shiver as he scanned the ground for more discarded bottles and cans. He wished he hadn't outgrown last year's coat, but wishes didn't fill empty stomachs, and they certainly didn't make his mother's sickness go away. Marina Mitchell, his mom, had always been strong, always smiling even when things were tough. But ever since the lupus got worse, even smiling seemed to take too much effort. Now she spent most of her time wrapped in blankets in the back seat of their old blue Honda, parked in the far corner of an abandoned Kmart parking lot, hidden behind overgrown bushes. She said it was safer that way, less chance of police knocking on their window, telling them they couldn't stay there, less chance of strangers getting too close. Tad hated seeing her like that. Her once strong hands now swollen and aching, her voice weaker every day. He knew she tried to hide it from him, but he wasn't a little kid anymore. He noticed everything. He sniffled, wiping his runny nose on his sleeve as he approached the alley behind Ray's Pizza. The dumpster there was sometimes a gold mine, whole slices of pizza, barely touched, tossed out at the end of the night. But as he turned the corner, his heart sank. A new chain and padlock secured the lid. "Sorry, kid," Ray called from the back door. Already knowing why Tad was there, health inspector's been cracking down. Can't leave it open anymore. Tad's face fell, but before he could turn away, Ray glanced over his shoulder, then quickly slipped him a brown paper bag. "But hey, I accidentally made an extra sandwich. Just don't tell anyone, okay?" Tad's fingers curled around the warm bag, the smell of bread and meat making his stomach cramp in anticipation. "Thanks, Mr. Ray," he murmured, clutching it tightly. He wanted to eat it right there, to devour it in a few bites, but he knew better. Mom hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The walk back to their car felt longer in the cold. Every step was weighed down by exhaustion, by the burden of being the provider when he was just a kid. He checked the lot carefully before approaching the car, looking out for police cruisers or people who might report them. Just last week, Officer Martinez had knocked on their window, telling them they couldn't sleep there overnight. Mom had smiled, her nurse's voice calm and convincing, telling him they were just resting in between shifts at the hospital. She hadn't told him she lost that job 3 months ago when her illness got too bad. That lie had bought them time, but Tad knew it wouldn't last forever. He tapped gently on the fogged-up window. "Mom?" Inside, wrapped in layers of blankets, Marina stirred slowly. Her face looked puffy today, not a good sign. "Hey, baby," she rasped, her voice weaker than usual. "Any luck?" Tad held up the sandwich and his bag of bottles. 17 so far, and look, Ray gave us food. He unwrapped it carefully, tearing the sandwich in half. "You eat first." His mother tried to argue, pushing the bigger half toward him. "You're growing," she insisted. "You need it more." But Tad shook his head. "You need medicine more. And medicine works better with food. That's what you always told your patients, remember?" A tear slipped down Marina's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, trying to smile. Tad pretended not to notice. He was getting good at pretending he didn't hear her crying at night, pretending he wasn't scared when strangers walked too close to their car, pretending he didn't miss school, his friends, his old life before everything fell apart. "I applied for disability again," Marina said between small bites. "The social worker at the clinic is helping this time. Maybe—" She didn't finish, but Tad knew what she meant. Maybe this time they'd approve it. Maybe this time they'd get real help. Maybe this time things would get better. But maybe didn't keep you warm at night, and maybe didn't make the fear in Tad's chest go away. He glanced at the crumpled flyer he'd picked up earlier in the day. "I saw signs for a big event downtown tomorrow," he said, trying to change the subject. "Some kind of political thing. They might have extra food after." Marina frowned. "Tad, we talked about this. It's not safe to—" "I'll be careful," he promised. "Nobody notices kids at those things, and sometimes they have whole boxes of sandwiches left over." His mother's face twisted with worry, but before she could argue, a coughing fit overtook her. Tad quickly grabbed their last water bottle, helping her drink slowly. Her hands shook as she held the bottle, and guilt gnawed at his stomach worse than hunger. If he was better at finding bottles, if he was braver about asking for help, if he was smarter about finding a real solution. But those thoughts, he pulled the blankets higher around her. "Try to sleep, Mom. I'm going to check the other side of the parking lot for more bottles." Outside, the night felt colder than before. Tad pretended not to notice how his mother clutched the blanket, or how her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Instead, he focused on counting his steps, scanning the ground for the glint of plastic or glass, on anything except the gnawing fear that tomorrow would be just like today. But maybe, just maybe, something would change. He looked up at the gray sky and whispered, "Please?" He didn't know who he was asking, or what exactly he was asking for, but he knew they couldn't keep living like this much longer. Something had to give. A siren wailed in the distance, making him jump. Time to move. He hitched his bag higher on his shoulder and disappeared into the dark streets, searching for anything that might help them survive one more day. The next morning, Tad Mitchell woke up to the sound of his mother's soft coughing, muffled beneath the heavy blankets wrapped around her frail body. The car windows were fogged from their breath, the cold seeping in through the tiny cracks where the old Honda's insulation had long since worn away. He shivered as he sat up, rubbing his hands together for warmth before glancing at his mother. She was still curled up, eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He hated seeing her like this. Once so full of life, always singing off-key in the kitchen, dancing around in her nursing scrubs, teasing him about eating too fast. Now she barely had the strength to sit up for long periods, and every day, the fear of waking up to silence gnawed at him. He shook the thought away. Today was about food. Today had to be better. Tad had a plan. He'd seen the flyers yesterday, some big political rally happening downtown, and big crowds meant distractions. Distractions meant opportunities. If he timed it right, he could grab food from the tables at the back, the ones volunteers always set up with bottled water and boxed lunches for attendees. He wasn't proud of taking leftovers, but pride didn't fill an empty stomach. His mother had made him promise to be careful, and he would be, but he couldn't come back empty-handed. By the time he reached the plaza, the city was already alive with energy. Volunteers in matching T-shirts handed out campaign buttons and flyers, their voices enthusiastic as they ushered people toward the stage. Large screens flanked the podium, broadcasting images of the candidates, their polished smiles and rehearsed speeches promising change. Tad barely glanced at them. His eyes were locked on the folding tables near the back, stacked with water bottles and neat rows of lunch boxes. The smell of fresh bread and deli meat made his stomach clench painfully, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten since the sandwich Mr. Ray had given him yesterday. He took a deep breath and moved carefully through the crowd, keeping his head down. The trick was to blend in, to look like he belonged. He pulled his hood up, making himself as small as possible. A woman with a clipboard caught his eye and smiled. "Here for the rally, young man?" she asked brightly. "Where are your parents?" Tad's heart pounded. He had learned how to lie smoothly, without hesitation. "My dad's up front," he said, nodding toward the packed crowd near the stage. "He sent me to get some water." She nodded, already distracted by someone else asking for directions. He slipped past her, weaving toward the food tables. Almost there. A voice boomed over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker." The crowd surged forward, heads turning toward the stage, and Tad seized the moment. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of a sandwich box. Just a little closer. Wham! He crashed into something solid. No, someone. A tall man in an expensive suit. The impact sent his plastic bag tumbling to the ground, bottles clattering and rolling in every direction. His breath caught in his throat as he dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather them before they were kicked away by the shifting crowd. His hands shook. Getting noticed was the last thing he wanted. "I'm sorry," he gasped, eyes darting around for an escape. "I didn't mean to." "Here, let me help." Tad froze. The man had crouched down beside him, picking up one of the bottles. His voice was kind, calm. Not angry, not dismissive. That was somehow worse. Anger Tad knew how to deal with. Pity he hated. But this wasn't pity, it was understanding. The man studied the bottle in his hand. "These are worth 5 cents each at the recycling center, right?" Tad swallowed hard, still not meeting his eyes. "Yeah," he mumbled, stuffing the last bottle back into his bag. The man nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My grandmother used to collect these, said it was honest work, even if some people looked down on it." That made Tad pause. Most people pretended not to see him digging through bins or picking up discarded bottles. Or worse, they gave him those looks. Looks that made him feel small, like something to be pitied or ignored. But this man spoke like he understood. "My name's JD, the man said, still crouched at eye level. "You know they've got extra lunches over there, more than they need. Would be a shame for them to go to waste." Tad finally looked up, meeting the man's gaze. He had lines around his eyes, the kind that crinkled when he smiled. His suit probably cost more than 6 months' rent at their old apartment, but he was still kneeling on the dirty plaza ground, helping a kid pick up bottles like it was the most natural thing in the world. Tad hesitated. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind. Don't take food from strangers. Don't trust people who ask too many questions. But then his stomach growled again, and the words slipped out before he could stop them. "My mom," he said quietly. "She needs food more than me." JD's expression shifted, just slightly, but Tad caught it. Not pity. Something deeper. "Where is she?" JD asked. Tad clutched his bag tighter. The wrong answer could mean trouble. Social services. Being separated from mom. But something in JD's eyes made him want to tell the truth. "She's sick," Tad whispered. "And we don't have anywhere else to go." JD was silent for a moment. Then he nodded, standing up and dusting off his knees. "Let's grab some food first," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Then we'll talk about your mom." Tad's heart hammered. He should run. He should disappear into the crowd. But his feet stayed rooted to the spot as JD turned toward the food table, speaking quietly to a volunteer. A moment later, she nodded and started filling a large paper bag. JD returned, handing Tad the bag and a couple of water bottles. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk," he said. Tad swallowed hard and, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, nodded. Maybe, just maybe, today really would be different. Tad clutched the heavy paper bag of food as he followed JD Vance through the bustling plaza, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He knew he should be careful. His mother had warned him about strangers, about people who asked too many questions, about the ones who pretended to help but only made things worse. But something about JD was different. Maybe it was the way he hadn't flinched at the sight of Tad scrambling for bottles, or the way he spoke about his grandmother collecting recyclables like it was a point of pride instead of shame. Maybe it was just the hunger clawing at his stomach, making him willing to take a risk. Either way, his feet kept moving, even when his mind screamed that he should turn and run. JD led him to a quieter spot, away from the noise of the rally, to a bench beneath a leafless tree. The February wind cut through Tad's thin hoodie, but he barely noticed. His fingers itched to open the bag, to tear into the food, but he forced himself to sit still. Nothing in life was free. That was a lesson he had learned long ago. He waited for the catch. JD sat beside him, elbows resting on his knees, studying him carefully. Not like he was something broken, not with pity, but with a curiosity that made Tad nervous. "You don't know who I am, do you?" JD asked, his voice casual like he already knew the answer. Tad shook his head. "Good," JD said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That makes this easier." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the rally carried over from the plaza, the amplified voice of a politician promising a brighter future, the occasional cheer from the crowd. It all felt distant, like a world Tad no longer belonged to. JD finally broke the silence. "How long have you and your mom been without a home?" he asked, his voice gentle but direct, as if he wasn't afraid of the truth. Tad tensed. Nobody ever asked it that plainly. They used softer words, words that made it seem less real. Going through a rough patch, experiencing housing insecurity. But JD just laid it out there. Tad's fingers curled around the edge of the bench. Lying would be easy. He could say they were just between places, that they had somewhere to go, But what was the point? JD had already seen him picking up bottles, had already seen the way he clung to that bag of food like it was gold. So Tad swallowed hard and told the truth. 3 months, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Since my mom got too sick to work. JD nodded, like that made perfect sense. She's a nurse, Tad continued. Was a nurse. She's really good at it, but... He twisted the hem of his hoodie between his fingers, staring at the cracks in the pavement. The lupus makes her hands shake sometimes. You can't shake when you're putting in IVs and stuff. JD's gaze darkened, but not with pity. Something else. Understanding. Medical bills? He asked. Tad nodded. And no insurance after she lost her job. We tried staying with friends, but everybody's got their own problems, you know. I do know, JD said, his voice quieter now. Tad glanced up at him and saw something shift in the man's expression. He wasn't just listening, he was remembering. His jaw tightened slightly, his hands clasped together as he stared straight ahead. My mother and we moved around a lot when I was your age. Sometimes stayed with friends, sometimes in places we shouldn't have been. People don't understand how fast it can happen. Tad's breath caught. He knew JD wasn't lying. The way he said it, the way his voice hardened just a little at the memory. He wasn't just being nice. He knew. The car's not so bad, Tad said quickly, trying to sound brave. At least it's ours. As long as we keep moving it every few days, the police usually leave us alone, and Mom says it's just temporary, until her disability application goes through. How's she doing with her medication? JD asked. Tad hesitated. JD didn't push. And maybe that was why, after a long pause, Tad muttered, She doesn't have any left. The words felt like a confession, like something he wasn't supposed to say out loud. JD checked his watch. I've got about 20 minutes before I need to be back at the rally, he said. Think your mom would be willing to talk to me? Warning bells rang in Tad's head. This was exactly what his mom had warned him about. Strangers wanting to help, strangers asking too many questions. People who meant well but could ruin everything. But JD seemed to sense his hesitation because he added, I'm not going to call anyone. I'm not here to separate you. But I know some people who might actually be able to help. Real help. Not just a meal for the night. Tad's fingers clenched around the bag. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe there was a way out of this. But hope was dangerous. Hope could hurt worse than hunger. Why do you care? The words slipped out before he could stop them. JD was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher, like he was remembering something he didn't talk about often. Because when I was about your age, somebody helped my family when we needed it. They didn't have to, probably had plenty of reasons not to, but they did it anyway. He turned to look directly at Tad, his expression unreadable. Sometimes help comes from strange places. The trick is being brave enough to accept it. Tad thought about his mother, huddled under blankets in their freezing car, about the way her cough had gotten worse, about the way she tried to hide how much pain she was in, about how scared he was every morning that this would be the day she wouldn't wake up. He squeezed his eyes shut. She's parked behind the old Kmart, he whispered finally. The one that closed last year. We have to be careful, though. The police sometimes check there. JD nodded, standing up and straightening his suit jacket. Lead the way. As they walked, Tad clutched the paper bag of food like a shield. He didn't know if he was making a huge mistake or doing the right thing. But when he thought about the way JD talked about his past, about his grandmother, about people who had helped him when they didn't have to, maybe, just maybe, this was one of those moments his mom always talked about. Those moments when fate, or God, or whatever you believed in, sent help just when you needed it most. Or maybe he was about to make everything worse. Either way, as they turned the corner toward the abandoned parking lot, he knew there was no going back now. Tad's footsteps felt heavier with every step as he led JD Vance toward the old Kmart parking lot. The closer they got, the more his nerves twisted into knots. He had never done anything like this before, bringing a stranger back to where he and his mother slept. It felt like breaking some unspoken rule, the one that kept them safe from being noticed, from being taken away, from losing what little they had left. His mother had always told him that survival meant staying invisible, and yet here he was, leading JD straight to the rusting blue Honda where his mother lay, curled up under layers of blankets that could do little against the bitter February cold. His fingers tightened around the bag of food, the paper crinkling under his grip. He didn't know if this was the right thing to do, but something in his gut told him it was too late to turn back now. As they approached, Tad hesitated, glancing up at JD, who stood a few feet back, his hands in his pockets, waiting. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding answers, just watching, giving Tad the space to decide. Taking a breath, Tad tapped lightly on the fogged-up window. "Mom," he whispered. Inside, the blankets shifted, and a moment later Marina Mitchell's face appeared, pale and exhausted. Her eyes widened when she saw the stranger standing behind her son. "Baby, what?" she started, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. She tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her stiff joints. "Who's this?" Her hand instinctively reached for Tad's shoulder, pulling him closer. Tad swallowed hard. "Mom, this is JD. He helped me get some food," he said carefully. He saw the way her body tensed, the way her fingers dug into the fabric of his sleeve. "He's not with the police." "He's not from social services," he added quickly, already anticipating her fears. He wants to talk." Marina's tired eyes flickered between her son and JD, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. "We're fine," she said, her voice firm, even as her hands trembled slightly from the cold and pain. "We don't need anything." JD took a slow step forward, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I'm not here to pressure you, Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently. "I just want to understand. Your son, he's smart, resourceful. He's trying to take care of you the best way he knows how. But no kid should have to carry that weight alone." Marina exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'm his mother. It's my job to take care of him, not the other way around." "I don't doubt that," JD said, his voice steady. "And I can see how much you love him. That's why I want to help, real help, not just a meal or a few dollars, but a way forward." Marina flinched at that word. Help. It had never meant what people thought it did. Help was usually a double-edged sword, one that came with consequences. Help meant pity, meant bureaucracy, meant questions that led to answers she couldn't afford to give. Help meant the risk of losing Tad. "We don't need charity," she murmured, her voice brittle. "I had a job, I had a plan, I just got sick." JD nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly. "My mother and I, we had times like this too. Different details, same struggle. And I know how quickly things spiral. One day you're getting by, the next, everything is slipping through your fingers." Marina's breath hitched slightly, but she said nothing. Tad looked between them, his mother's tense shoulders, JD's patient but unwavering stance. He could feel something shifting, something breaking open. "Mom," he said, his voice small but determined. "Please, just listen." Marina's lips pressed together. She knew she should shut this down, should tell this man to walk away, that they didn't need his interference. But when she looked at her son, his too thin frame, the dark circles under his young eyes, the way he clutched that bag of food like it was life itself, she knew the truth. They couldn't keep going like this. With a slow, reluctant sigh, she nodded toward JD. "Fine," she said. "Talk." JD sat on the curb, as if he had all the time in the world. "I work with some people," he began. "People who specialize in situations like yours. Housing assistance, medical advocacy, getting families back on their feet. No red tape, no endless waiting lists, just action." Marina let out a hollow laugh. "Sounds too good to be true." JD shrugged. "Maybe, but what's the harm in hearing them out?" She wanted to argue, wanted to say that she had spent months fighting the system, that she had already filled out 1,000 forms only to be told she didn't qualify, that she had begged for help in a world that didn't have time for people like her. But her body ached, her son was starving, and the bitter truth was that she had no more moves left to make. "And if I say yes, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I make a call, JD said simply. I know someone, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez. She runs a housing program for people with medical needs. She knows how to cut through the red tape, how to get things done. And she's about 20 minutes away. Marina hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. For months she had kept her world small, had convinced herself that if she just held on long enough she could fix things on her own. But Tad was right. She was out of time, and if she didn't take this chance, what then? Her fingers tightened around the blanket, then slowly loosened. Call her, she whispered. JD nodded, pulling out his phone. As he stepped away to make the call, Marina turned to her son, brushing his hair back with a shaking hand. Are you sure about this, baby? Tad looked at her, really looked at her, at the exhaustion etched into every inch of her face, at the hope she was too afraid to feel. We have to try, Mom, he said. We can't do this alone anymore. Marina closed her eyes for a long moment, then nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Marina Mitchell sat stiffly in the front seat of the old Honda, her body curled under the layers of blankets that barely held in the warmth. She had been through countless conversations with well-meaning people before. Nurses at the free clinic, social workers who made promises they couldn't keep, even kind strangers who wanted to help but didn't understand how complicated things really were. Every time it ended the same way. Another dead end, another disappointment, another reminder that the system wasn't built for people like her. And now here was this man, JD Vance, standing outside her car, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to someone named Carmen. Tad sat next to her, his wide, hopeful eyes watching every movement JD made. Marina wanted to believe that this was different. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, something was finally going to change. But she had learned the hard way that believing in hope could be dangerous. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the blankets over her lap. The pain in her joints was worse today, a deep, pulsing ache that radiated through her arms and legs. She tried not to show it, but Tad always noticed. He had become too good at reading the signs. How she held her breath when she moved, how she clenched her fists when the pain flared up, how her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. He saw it all, and it made her heart ache. Her baby boy, 11 years old, carrying burdens no child should have to carry. Selling recyclables to buy food. Keeping watch at night while she slept, afraid someone would come and take the car, their only shelter, away. He had grown up too fast, and she had no way to stop it. JD finished his call and turned back toward them, his expression unreadable. Marina braced herself for the familiar disappointment, for the polite apology, for the inevitable words, I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do. Instead, JD's voice was calm, steady, like he was stating a fact instead of making an offer. Carmen will meet us at Ruby's Diner in 20 minutes, he said. She's already putting things in motion. She wants to meet you, hear your story, and figure out the next steps. Marina blinked, caught off guard. That fast? She asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. The system never moved fast. Applications took weeks, months, years. Assistance came too late or not at all. But JD just nodded. That fast, he confirmed. Carmen doesn't do waiting lists or endless paperwork. If she says she can help, she means it. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. But there was still that nagging voice in the back of her mind. The one that had been hardened by every rejection, every failure, every impossible obstacle. And what's the catch? She asked, folding her arms. Nothing's ever free. JD studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. There's no catch, he said. No hidden conditions, no fine print. Just people helping people, because someone once did the same for me. Marina let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to Tad, who was watching her anxiously, his hands gripping the paper bag of food JD had given him like it was the most precious thing in the world. Mom, please, he whispered. Let's just go. The fear in his voice cut straight through her, fear that she would say no, Fear that she would let her pride, her exhaustion, her stubbornness get in the way of something real. And maybe she would have if it weren't for the fact that she had run out of options. Her body couldn't take much more. Tad couldn't take much more. They were surviving, but barely. And deep down she knew survival wasn't enough. Not for him, not for either of them. She swallowed hard and looked back at JD. "All right," she said finally, forcing the words out before she could change her mind. "Let's go." JD didn't react with relief or triumph. He just nodded, as if he had known all along that she would come to this decision. "I'll drive," he said simply. "It's warmer in my car." Marina hesitated, but then Tad was already moving, gathering their few belongings, a backpack filled with important documents, a plastic bag holding their last set of clean clothes. As they stepped out of the Honda, the freezing wind hit her like a slap. She bit back a grimace as she felt the sharp sting in her bones. JD opened the passenger door of his car for her, and for a moment she hesitated. Letting someone else drive meant giving up control, and control was the only thing she had left. But then Tad climbed into the back seat, clutching the bag of food like a lifeline, and she knew there was no turning back now. The warmth of the car was overwhelming after weeks of freezing nights. Marina closed her eyes for a moment, letting the heat soak into her skin, thawing the stiffness in her fingers. JD didn't speak as he pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't push her to talk, didn't bombard her with questions or reassurances. He just drove, letting the silence stretch between them. After a while, she finally spoke, her voice quieter now, less defensive. "You said someone helped you once," she said. "What happened?" JD kept his eyes on the road. "My mom had a hard time when I was growing up," he said. "We moved around a lot. Sometimes we had a place to stay, sometimes we didn't. There were times when I thought we'd never get out of it. But then one person, just one, stepped in at the right time, helped us find stability, helped us see a way forward. It changed everything." Marina studied him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity. She found none. "And now you're doing the same for someone else," she murmured. JD glanced at her, a small, knowing smile on his lips. "It's what you do when someone gives you a second chance," he said. "You pass it on." She looked out the window as the city passed by, the streets she had come to know too well after months of wandering. This was it, a chance, however small, at something better. She just had to be willing to take it. Ruby's Diner came into view, its neon sign flickering against the gray morning sky. Marina exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was happening. Whether she was ready or not, change was coming, and for the first time in a long time she let herself wonder, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be a bad thing after all. Ruby's Diner was warmer than Marina expected. The scent of coffee and maple syrup hung in the air, and the soft hum of conversation filled the space. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, no-frills diner with worn leather booths and scuffed floors. But to Marina, it felt like stepping into a different world, a world where people weren't constantly looking over their shoulders, where warmth wasn't a luxury, where the simple act of sitting at a table and ordering a meal wasn't something to be weighed against the cost of medicine or rent. JD led the way, guiding them to a booth near the back, away from the prying eyes of the other customers. Tad slid in next to his mother, his fingers still curled tightly around the paper bag of food he had been given earlier. It was as if he was afraid that if he let go of it, the kindness that had been extended to them might vanish. A waitress appeared with a welcoming smile, placing menus in front of them without a hint of judgment in her expression. "Take your time, sweeties," she said. "Coffee's on the house." Marina's fingers twitched against the table. It had been so long since someone had offered something without expecting anything in return. Across from her, JD ordered a coffee and leaned back in his seat. "Carmen will be here any minute," he said. "She's already making calls, putting things in motion." Marina swallowed hard, staring down at the menu. The prices seemed surreal. $4.99 for pancakes, $3.50 for eggs and toast. Not long ago, this would have been a casual breakfast, something she and Tad could have shared on a lazy Saturday morning. Now it felt indulgent, excessive, almost wrong. She hesitated, debating whether she should refuse the offer, but then Tad glanced up at her. His big eyes filled with silent pleading. "Mom," he whispered, "please, eat something." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. When the waitress returned, she ordered eggs and toast. Something simple, something safe. Tad, after a small nudge from JD, ordered chocolate chip pancakes, his voice barely above a whisper. JD, on the other hand, ordered the full breakfast platter, casually mentioning that he might need help finishing his hash browns. Marina saw through it instantly. He was giving Tad permission to take more without feeling like a burden. Minutes later, Carmen arrived. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a warm smile. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up and she carried a worn leather briefcase covered in stickers, some political, some humorous, all a reflection of someone who had spent her life in the trenches of advocacy work. "Marina," she greeted, sliding into the booth across from her. "It's good to meet you. JD told me a little about your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you." Marina's first instinct was to deflect, to downplay, to brush it all off as temporary. But when she met Carmen's gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. Not pity. Not condescension. Just genuine, no-nonsense understanding. So she took a breath and told the truth. She told Carmen about the lupus, about how she had been working as a nurse for 15 years until the symptoms made it impossible to do her job. She explained how she had applied for disability, only to be denied, and how she had tried everything to stay afloat, using up her savings, taking on small side jobs when she could, moving in with friends when they had nowhere else to go. But in the end, it hadn't been enough, and when they had finally run out of options, they had ended up in the car. Carmen listened intently, nodding in all the right places, occasionally jotting down notes in a small notebook. When Marina finished, there was a long silence. Then Carmen said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." The certainty in her voice startled Marina. Not "here's what we can try" or "here's what might work," but "here's what we're going to do." Like it was already decided, like the outcome had already been determined. "First," Carmen continued, "we're going to get you into emergency housing, not a shelter, an actual apartment. We have partnerships with landlords who reserve units for cases like yours. It's clean, it's safe, and it'll give you a place to recover while we work on getting your disability appeal pushed through." Marina's fingers clenched around her coffee cup. "Just like that?" she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. "You can just make that happen?" Carmen smiled. "I can," she said, "because I've done it before." A strange, fragile hope flickered in Marina's chest. "And after that?" "After that, we get you the medical support you need," Carmen continued. "You'll meet with our healthcare advocacy team. They specialize in cases like yours, chronic illnesses, disability claims, medication access. We'll make sure you get the treatment you need without worrying about insurance loopholes." Tad was staring at Carmen like she was some kind of magician. "And my mom will get better?" he asked, his voice small. Carmen softened. "Your mom is already strong," she said. "She's been holding up the weight of the world on her shoulders. We're just going to make sure she doesn't have to do it alone anymore." Marina looked down, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of help. "What about work?" she asked. "I don't want to just sit around waiting for government checks." "That's the last step," Carmen said. "Once your health is stabilized, we'll work on employment options. Part-time, flexible, something that works with your medical needs. I have a few connections in the healthcare field. Nurses who had to step back from hospital work but found other ways to stay in the field." Marina let out a shaky breath. It was overwhelming. It was too much. It was everything she had been trying and failing to do on her own. And suddenly, for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Carmen reached into her bag and pulled out a set of keys. "Your apartment is ready," she said. "It's small, but it's yours. We can go there after breakfast." Marina stared at the keys, her hands trembling. She reached out and took them, the cool metal pressing into her palm like proof that this wasn't a dream. She turned to Tad, who was grinning so wide it nearly broke her heart. "We have a home," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Marina closed her eyes, just for a moment, and allowed herself to believe. For the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine a future where they weren't just surviving, but living. The apartment was small, just one bedroom with a modest living space, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. but to Marina and Tad it felt like a palace. The walls were clean, the floors solid beneath their feet, and the heat worked. A simple luxury they had been without for so long. Marina stood in the middle of the living room, the weight of the past few months pressing down on her all at once. She smiled down. She had been so used to sleeping in the car, waking up stiff and cold, feeling the uncertainty of each day clawing at the edges of her sanity. Now, standing in a space that was theirs, a space where she could lock the door and breathe without fear of being told to leave, the emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Tad, on the other hand, was everywhere at once. He ran his hands over the smooth counters in the kitchen, peeked inside the bathroom, and marveled at the bed in the single bedroom. "Mom," he whispered in awe, his fingers gripping the doorframe, "we have a bed." Marina's knees nearly buckled. She had spent so much time fighting, so much time pushing through each impossible day, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to feel safe. She turned to Carmen, who stood at the door with a knowing smile. "It's not much," Carmen said, "but it's a start." "It's everything," Marina choked out, gripping the apartment keys in her fist. JD entered the room, carrying a box filled with groceries. "Got you stocked up for the next few weeks," he said, setting it on the kitchen counter. "Basics: milk, eggs, bread, peanut butter, some canned goods, and there's a food bank a few blocks away if you need more." Tad looked at the bag of groceries like it was Christmas morning. He pulled out a loaf of bread and turned it over in his hands as if making sure it was real. The past few months had been a steady cycle of rationing food, of choosing between eating or saving what little they had left for the next day. To see full cupboards, even with just the essentials, felt like stepping into a new world. Carmen handed Marina a folder. "In here you'll find everything you need. Information about the food bank, a list of clinics that can help with your lupus treatment, transportation options, and contacts for employment opportunities once you're ready. You don't have to do everything at once. Take your time." Marina swallowed hard. She wasn't used to people giving her time. The system had always felt like a race, a constant struggle to keep up, to prove she deserved help, to jump through endless hoops. But here was a woman telling her she didn't have to sprint, that she could breathe. I don't know how to thank you," Marina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carmen smiled gently. "You don't have to. Just get better. And one day, if you're able, help someone else." The weight of those words settled deep into Marina's chest. She thought about all the times she had been turned away, all the times she had been made to feel like a burden. And yet, here she was, being offered kindness with no strings attached. JD leaned against the counter, watching them both. "It's a lot to take in," he said. "I remember when someone helped my family, it almost felt unreal at first, like it was going to disappear the moment we got comfortable." Marina nodded, understanding completely. "That's exactly what it feels like." JD gestured around the small apartment. "But it's not going anywhere. This is real. And you're not alone." Tad had stopped rummaging through the groceries and now stood in the doorway, listening to every word. His small shoulders, which had been carrying too much weight for too long, seemed to relax for the first time in months. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustments. Marina met with a medical advocate who helped her set up appointments for physical therapy and medication management. The clinic arranged for a specialist to assess her condition, and for the first time in a long time, she had hoped that her health might improve. The pain in her joints was still there, but knowing she would soon receive proper care made it easier to bear. Tad started at Roosevelt Middle School the following Monday. He was nervous, shifting from foot to foot as they stood in front of the school doors, his backpack, one that had been donated from the resource center, hanging loosely off his shoulders. "You'll do great," Marina assured him, running a hand over his hair. "I don't know," Tad mumbled. "It's been a while since I've been in a real classroom." Marina crouched down so they were at eye level. "You are smart and you are strong," she said firmly, "and you belong here." Tad nodded, gripping the straps of his backpack a little tighter. Then, with a final look at his mother, he squared his shoulders and walked inside. Marina watched him go, her chest swelling with both pride and the sharp sting of reality. He had missed out on so much, but now he had a chance. Later that afternoon, JD stopped by to check in. He brought a desk and a small lamp for Tad, setting it up in the corner of the living room. Every kid needs a place to study, he said. Education's the way forward. Marina ran her fingers over the surface of the desk, blinking back tears. You think of everything, JD shrugged. I think about what I wish someone had thought of for me. As the days turned into weeks, stability began to feel less like a temporary relief and more like a foundation. The little things, having a working stove, a bathroom with running water, a space that was theirs, became reminders that they were rebuilding. Marina started part-time work at a clinic, helping with patient intake. It wasn't the nursing job she had before, but it was something. It was a step forward. One evening, as she and Tad sat at their small kitchen table, eating dinner together without worrying about where their next meal would come from, she reached across and squeezed his hand. We made it, she whispered. Tad smiled. Yeah, Mom, he said. We did. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving. They were living. JD Vance sat across from Marina and Tad in their small but cozy apartment, his usual confident demeanor softened by something more personal, something unspoken. He had stopped by under the pretense of checking in, of making sure they had everything they needed. But as he settled into the chair by the kitchen table, it was clear there was something else on his mind. Marina, still adjusting to the security of having a home again, sipped from a warm mug of tea, her eyes studying JD with quiet curiosity. Tad, freshly home from school, sat on the floor organizing the few books he had been given by the school counselor, though he kept glancing up, sensing that something important was about to be said. JD leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, and exhaled. There's something I haven't told you yet, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Something about why I do this. He rubbed his hands together, as if working up the nerve to share something long buried. The truth is, when I met Tad at that rally, I didn't just see a kid looking for food, I saw myself. Years ago, in a different city, but living the same struggle, Marina straightened, setting her mug down carefully. You? You were homeless? She asked, though the answer was already written in the distant look in his eyes. JD nodded. Yeah, my mom and I bounced around a lot when I was young. Sometimes we stayed with friends, sometimes we slept in motels, and sometimes, when things were really bad, we lived in our car, just like you and Tad. He looked at Marina then, and something in his gaze made her breath hitch. I know what it's like to wake up and not know where you'll sleep that night. I know what it's like to watch your mother fight so hard to hold everything together, even when her body, or the world around her, was working against her. Marina's throat tightened. It was one thing to hear kind words from someone who wanted to help, but to hear them from someone who had lived it, it was different. It made the kindness real, made the hope feel less fragile. Tad, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. How did you get out? His voice was small, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. JD smiled, but it was tinged with something bittersweet. Because someone noticed, he said simply. A woman named Margaret. She ran a small community center in our town, and one day she found us in a parking lot, just like I found you. She didn't just give us food or a place to stay. She helped my mom find a job, helped us get into stable housing, connected me with a mentor who made sure I stayed in school. She didn't have to do any of it, but she did, and because of her, my life changed. Silence settled in the room, thick with unspoken emotions. Marina glanced at Tad, whose fingers curled tightly around the book in his lap. JD let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. You know, back then, I didn't understand why she did it. I kept waiting for the catch, for the moment when we'd have to pay it all back. But there was no catch. Margaret once told me, hope is contagious. Someone gave it to me when I needed it, and now I'm giving it to you. Your only job is to pass it on when it's your turn. Marina blinked back, the tears stinging her eyes. And that's why you do this, she whispered. JD nodded. Yeah, that's why I look for kids like Tad, families like yours, because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one cares, and I know how much of a difference it makes when someone does. Tad swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. So, this is my turn now? JD smiled, reaching over to ruffle the boy's hair. "Not yet, buddy," he said warmly. "Right now, your job is to go to school, take care of your mom, and remember that no matter what, you're not alone anymore." Marina closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world alone. When she opened them again, she met JD's gaze and nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing those 2 words could never be enough, but hoping he understood. JD smiled. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just promise me that one day, when you see someone who needs hope the way you did, you'll pass it on." And in that moment, Marina knew she would. The news came on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Marina had just finished a follow-up call with her medical advocate, confirming her next appointment for physical therapy, while Tad sat at the kitchen table finishing his homework. The apartment, once an unfamiliar space, now felt like home. A place where they could breathe, where Tad could come home from school without wondering if they'd still be there tomorrow. But as soon as JD stepped inside, carrying a manila folder and a thoughtful expression, Marina knew something big was about to change. He placed the folder on the table, tapping it lightly. "I've been thinking about what's next for you two," he said. "You've made incredible progress here, but I remember you mentioning that you have family in Michigan. Your sister, right?" Marina stiffened slightly, her hands still on the coffee cup she had been nursing for the past hour. "Sarah," she said slowly. "We haven't seen each other in years, not since," she trailed off, unwilling to say what they all knew, "not since everything fell apart." JD nodded. "I reached out to Carmen and she looked into some options. There's a new housing program in Michigan, one designed for families in transition, especially those with medical needs. It's in an accessible complex, first-floor unit, 2 bedrooms. Rent is income adjusted, so it'll be affordable even with your disability benefits. But the best part?" He glanced at Tad, who had stopped writing and was staring at him wide-eyed. "It's only a few miles from your sister's place." Marina's breath hitched. She hadn't let herself think about Sarah in a long time. They had spoken briefly after things got bad, but shame had kept Marina from reaching out too much. Sarah had offered help before, but at the time, Marina had been too proud, too determined to fix things on her own. Now that stubbornness felt foolish. Tad was the first to speak. "Michigan?" His voice was cautious, uncertain. "That's far." JD chuckled. "Yeah, it is. But think about it. You'd be closer to family, your mom would have more support while she continues her treatment, and you, Tad, you'd get to start fresh. New school, new opportunities. I even checked. There's a community center nearby with a youth mentorship program. They do a lot of the same things we do here." Marina's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "How would we even get there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. JD flipped open the folder, revealing a set of documents. "That's where my foundation comes in," he said. "We have a relocation assistance program. We cover moving costs, help with transportation, and make sure families have everything they need to transition smoothly. Your sister's already on board. She said she'd help however she can." The weight of it all settled heavily on Marina's chest. She had spent so long fighting just to survive that the idea of actually moving forward felt almost impossible. But wasn't that the point of all this? Wasn't that why she had fought so hard? Why JD and Carmen and so many others had helped? To give them a chance at more than just survival? She turned to Tad, who was staring down at his notebook, processing. "Baby," she said softly, "what do you think?" Tad bit his lip, then shrugged. I like it here. I like my school, and the food bank." He glanced up at JD. "What about the people here? What about you?" JD smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I'll always be around," he assured him, "and you'll always have a place here. But sometimes the best thing we can do is move forward, take a chance on something better." Tad was quiet for a long moment, then finally asked, "Will I still be able to help people? Like here?" JD's smile widened. "Absolutely. There are food banks in Michigan, community programs, schools that need kids like you, kids who know what it means to fight through tough times and come out stronger. You're not just leaving, you're bringing everything you've learned with you." Marina exhaled slowly, looking down at the documents. It was all right there. Housing details, a breakdown of costs, most of which were covered, a schedule for medical transfers, even a list of resources Sarah had already looked into on their behalf. For so long, the idea of home had been a dream. A wish whispered into the night when she was too exhausted to fight anymore. But now, it was real. It had an address, a foundation, a future. She reached across the table, gripping JD's hand tightly. "Okay," she whispered, the word trembling but firm. "Okay, let's do this." JD squeezed her hand back, then nodded at Tad. "Michigan's getting a pretty great new addition." Tad hesitated, then grinned. "Yeah," he said, "I guess they are." The move to Michigan wasn't just about relocating. It was about transformation. For months, Tad and Marina had lived in survival mode, scraping by day after day, unsure of what the future held. Now, as they settled into their new apartment, surrounded by boxes of donated furniture and groceries, they felt something unfamiliar. Stability. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and a small playground just a block away. Their new home was warm, secure, and filled with possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, they weren't alone. Sarah had been waiting for them when they arrived, her arms wide open, tears brimming in her eyes as she hugged her sister for the first time in years. The shame Marina had once carried melted away in that embrace, replaced by something stronger: family, understanding, love. Tad adjusted quickly, enrolling in his new school with a confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just that he had a permanent address now, or a bed to sleep in. It was that he had learned something valuable from the months he spent struggling. Kindness had the power to change lives. He joined the community center JD had told him about, not just as a participant but as a volunteer. At the food pantry, he helped unpack deliveries and sort donations, remembering how it felt to receive that same help when he and his mother needed it most. He spoke with kids who had stories like his, kids who had slept in cars, kids who understood hunger the way few others did. And slowly, just as JD had promised, he became a part of something bigger than himself. Marina, too, found new purpose. With Sarah's support and the medical care she had desperately needed, her health improved. The pain in her joints became more manageable, the fatigue less overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just existing, she was living. And as soon as she was able, she did what she had always dreamed of doing. She returned to nursing. It started part-time at a community clinic, working with families who couldn't afford health care, helping parents who were in the same desperate situations she had once faced. She saw herself in the exhausted mothers who walked through the doors, in the worried children who clung to their parents' hands. And because she understood, she could offer more than just medical care. She could offer hope. JD had once told her that kindness created a ripple effect, that the help he received as a child led him to help others, and that one act of compassion could echo for years. Now she saw it happening in her own life. The kindness of one man had set off a chain of events that had taken her and Tad from a freezing car to a home filled with warmth and security. And now she was in a position to do the same for others. She thought about JD often, about the moment he had knelt beside Tad at that rally, picking up bottles as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about the way he had looked at her that first day, not with pity, but with recognition. One afternoon, as Tad helped stock shelves at the food pantry, his phone buzzed with a text from JD. "How's Michigan treating you?" Tad smiled, typing back quickly. "Cold, but good. Mom's working again. I'm helping at the center. Thanks for everything." A moment later, JD's response appeared. "That's what it's all about. Keep passing it on." Tad pocketed his phone and looked around at the shelves, the bags of food, the people who had come for help. He knew his story wasn't unique, that there were still countless families who were where he and his mother had once been. But now, thanks to JD, Carmen, Sarah, and so many others, he was no longer just a recipient of kindness. He was part of the ripple effect, and he had no doubt that one day, someone else would be too. Life has a way of teaching us that the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change far beyond what we can see. The story of Tad, Marina, and JD Vance reminds us that no matter how difficult life becomes, hope can be found in the most unexpected places. It teaches us that even in the darkest of times, a single act of compassion, a shared meal, a helping hand, a listening ear, can set off a chain reaction that changes lives. For many older adults, this message resonates deeply, as they have spent a lifetime witnessing how communities thrive not through wealth or power, but through connection, generosity, and the willingness to help one another. This story also speaks to the power of resilience, a quality familiar to many seniors who have faced and overcome hardships throughout their lives. Marina's journey, from struggling in silence to accepting help and finding stability, reflects the truth that strength is not just about enduring hardship, it is also about knowing when to lean on others. JD's commitment to giving back reminds us that gratitude is best expressed through action. When we help others, we not only honor the kindness we've received in our own lives, but we also ensure that future generations inherit a world where compassion and community still matter. For older adults, this is a call to reflect on their own impact. Have you been the helping hand in someone's life? Have you shared wisdom, offered comfort, or provided guidance to those in need? And if you are facing struggles yourself, remember that it is never too late to accept kindness and allow others to be part of your journey. This story is a testament to the fact that we are all connected, and the way we choose to treat each other, especially in times of need, can leave a lasting legacy. Because in the end, it is not wealth or success that defines a life well lived, but the love, support, and kindness we pass on to others.